The candles burned with a crooked, unnatural light, dripping molten wax that smelled faintly of iron and smoke, casting long, twisting shadows that crawled across the gilded walls like living things. On the night of the 3rd of March, 1672, the palace was alive with sound, though the clatter of silver and the faintly sweet odor of roasted meats carried an unease that no laughter could mask. The chefs noticed first that the platters shifted when no one was watching, trays of pheasant and venison sliding along the polished floors as if guided by invisible hands, leaving behind only the faint, coppery tang of blood, warm and lingering. The guests, oblivious, lifted crystal goblets to lips already tinged with unease, the ruby wine catching the candlelight in impossible reflections, thick and dark as if it carried more than mere flavor. Shadows began to stretch along the walls, bending unnaturally, curling over the tapestries and gilded moldings, and for a moment the gold itself seemed to breathe, pulsing with a rhythm older than any human heart, a slow inhale and exhale that pressed against the ears and the chest. The silver candelabras trembled faintly, as though responding to some imperceptible vibration, each taper flickering in sync with the invisible pulse that threaded through the air, vibrating across marble floors and velvet curtains alike. The scent of roasted meats mingled with the faintly metallic tang of the air, thick and warm, carrying with it a suggestion of decay beneath the surface sweetness, a memory of feasts long forgotten, pressed into the very stones of the palace. Platters continued to vanish, appearing only moments later in places impossible for human hands to reach, stacked neatly atop sideboards or balanced along window ledges, the food untouched, but the presence of something else palpable in the heat that clung to the air. Guests tilted their heads as a faint whisper brushed their ears, a wordless susurration that drew muscles taut and made hearts quicken, though nothing visible moved except the shadows, lengthening with deliberate intent, pooling in corners and along the edges of paintings as if the gilded frames themselves were exhaling. The chandeliers trembled as well, the crystals singing faintly against each other in a sound like brittle bones, a high, delicate resonance that threaded through the hall, pressing against the backs of the necks and making stomachs clench. The air grew warmer, almost viscous, heavy with the weight of breath and history, each inhale tasting faintly of iron and spice and the smoke of countless torches that had burned in the same hall centuries before. The guests laughed, voices too bright, too sharp, cutting through the tension that crept under doors and along the edges of tapestries. And yet the laughter did nothing to dissipate the sense that something was watching, something patient and unhurried, moving through the gilded corridors with steps that left no mark. Each footfall on the polished marble echoed, stretching unnaturally, a reminder that the hall itself had memory, had patience, had the ability to record every gesture and glance, every sip of wine and bite of roasted flesh, to store it and breathe it back into the present with imperceptible insistence. The chefs, perspiring beneath their caps, felt it first in their hands, a subtle resistance in the lifting of platters, the sliding of knives across boards, the weight of the air pressing down, folding muscle and sinew into a rhythm they did not understand. It was as though the palace itself had drawn a slow, deliberate breath and would not exhale until all present had been pressed into its pattern, folded into the geometry of light and shadow, wine and flesh, memory and anticipation. By the time the night had thickened beyond recall, the shadows along the walls had begun to pulse, stretching and contracting in sync with some unseen heart, a deliberate, measured beat that pressed against ribs and spine alike, and those who paused too long felt the hairs along their necks rise as if brushed by fingers that did not exist. The gilded ceilings shimmered with a cold, metallic gleam, reflecting not the guests but fragments of themselves, distorted and elongated, flickering in the candlelight, and the chefs, glancing at these impossible images, realized that the banquet was no longer theirs to serve. It belonged to the palace, to the gold and the shadows and the pulse that ran beneath the marble and tapestry alike, a slow, patient insistence that would claim all who lingered too long, pressing memory and flesh into a rhythm older than laughter, older than wine, older than life itself. The wine arrived, poured from bottles stamped with the royal crest, deep red and viscous, catching the candlelight in impossible reflections, glimmering as if liquid fire had been captured in crystal. On the night of the 4th of March, 1672, the banquet hall throbbed with a presence invisible to those who laughed and raised their goblets, yet felt in the very marrow of their bones, a slow, insidious weight pressing against the spine and wrists, coiling like a living thing through the polished air. Those who drank it felt first a subtle numbness, a tingling behind the ears, a forgetting that began in the small, insignificant details, names of acquaintances slipping from memory, faces of servants blurring into the golden glow of chandeliers, the faint melody of a harpsichord unraveling into silence. Limbs no longer felt as they had moments before, hands and feet growing heavy, shoulders pressing downward as if pulled by an invisible tether anchored somewhere within the walls themselves. Each step across the polished marble produced the faintest crackling, a sound like brittle bones bending beneath weight that could not be measured, each echo lengthening unnaturally, lingering in the ears long after the foot had left the surface, vibrating through tendons and sinew, threading into the rhythm of the pulse that had begun to creep through the room. The chandeliers trembled, crystals chiming softly against one another, a brittle, metallic song that threaded through the hall like a memory of screams too delicate for flesh to sustain, a sound that pressed the living into awareness of absence, of something that had always been, waiting patiently. In the glittering mirrors, pale faces appeared where none should have existed, blinking and twisting with impossible timing, eyes wide in silent recognition, mouths opening and closing without sound, their movements precise and deliberate, reflecting not the present but fragments of histories that had been consumed and pressed into the walls. Each reflection held a memory of someone who had stood there before, a whisper of bone and blood and candle smoke pressed into the silvered glass, and the living found themselves staring too long, caught in the pull, their own reflections beginning to dissolve at the edges, limbs elongating, torsos stretching in a rhythm that mirrored the shadows creeping along the gilded walls. The air grew thick, heavy with the combined perfume of roasted meats, spiced wine, melting wax, and something older, fouler, a tang of iron that seemed to belong not to the wine or the meat, but to memory itself, pressing against the lungs and seeping into the marrow, forcing the heartbeat into sync with the slow, deliberate pulse threading through the hall. The guests moved, unaware that each step folded them deeper into the geometry of the palace, each breath inhaling fragments of those who had gone before, fragments of laughter and grief, of screams and whispers, pressed into the marble floors and gold-leafed ceilings like ink into paper. The waiters moved carefully between tables, their hands trembling despite years of service, the silver trays heavy in a way that defied their weight, plates of food sliding slightly before them as though the air itself had learned to guide the dishes. Shadows pooled at the corners of the hall, stretching across the tapestries, crawling along the legs of chairs and tables, coiling around feet, rising slowly up the walls, bending in ways impossible for flesh and bone, forming shapes that suggested gestures and motions too deliberate to be accidental. The mirrors multiplied the effect, reflecting not the guests but the shadows of the guests, layering forms over forms until it was impossible to tell which was real, which was memory, and which was something that had never been alive at all. Every sip of wine drew another thread from the living into the rhythm of the hall, a slow absorption of presence, a folding into the pulse that had begun to beat beneath the marble and behind the gilded frames, vibrating in tune with the invisible eyes that watched from ceilings, from chandeliers, from the silvery reflections that caught movement in ways the mind could not follow. The heavier the air grew, the more the guests moved in a trance-like cadence, their gestures precise yet unremembered, each motion folding them further into the hall, their bodies bending subtly to match the elongated movements of the shadows, their own mouths opening and closing as though rehearsing some choreography that belonged neither to them nor to life. The floorboards whispered beneath their boots, the subtle creak of which stretched into the sound of groaning bodies. The marble pressed against their soles as if alive, curving slightly to resist each footfall, the echo of steps layering over echoes that had lived in the halls long before their arrival. The ceilings shimmered, the gold leaf twisting, curling, forming patterns that mimicked gestures of those who had already been claimed, their fingers reaching down through the air, their eyes reflected faintly in the mirrors, their mouths moving in silent song that tugged at memory and muscle alike. The scent of melted wax, wine, and roasted meats mingled with something metallic and damp, a tang of blood and decay pressed into the air by centuries of feasts and vanishings, thickening until it coated the tongue, filled the sinuses, and pressed against the lining of the lungs, embedding itself into the flesh. Guests who paused, trying to lift their gaze, found that their reflections did not move with them, but instead performed a parallel ritual, bending, twisting, consumed by a choreography of memory they could not comprehend but were now a part of, their own limbs following the impossible rhythm without conscious thought. The wine, deep red and viscous, drew another layer of forgetfulness, memory slipping faster now, faces once familiar dissolving into the shifting shadows, names falling from tongues as if stolen, each swallow pressing awareness into a lattice of time and absence, where all that had come before merged with the present into a single, unyielding pulse. The gilded frames began to warp subtly, stretching along the walls, elongating the ceilings, bending the tapestries into grotesque loops, as if the palace itself were breathing in time with the rhythm of the vanished, shaping reality around the pulse that had begun to dictate movement, breath, and thought. Hands that reached for goblets felt the subtle resistance of something unseen, the pull of invisible threads pressing muscle and bone into alignment with a choreography older than memory, older than laughter, older than grief. The mirrors and shadows worked together, folding the living into their own reflections, pressing their presence into history, layering their forms over the forms of guests long dead, their gestures repeated in echoes that no longer belonged to life, but to the hall itself. Every inhalation drew fragments of those long gone into the chest, embedding the pulse into sinew, tendon, and bone, synchronizing the heartbeat with the rhythm of a feast that had never truly ended. And every exhale returned a taste of absence, iron and wine and wax and decay, pressing the living into the palace in a way that was precise, deliberate, and inevitable. The guests walked, lifted goblets, chewed morsels of food, all unaware that each action folded them deeper into the geometry of the hall, deeper into the rhythm of presence and absence, into the slow, patient choreography of a palace that had learned to claim life in silence, in reflection, and in the viscous pull of ruby-red wine. Shadows lengthened, mirrors multiplied, the chandeliers sang faintly, and the wine flowed, heavy and deliberate, as though aware of the living it drew into the rhythm, embedding each movement, each thought, each heartbeat into the pulse of the palace, a slow, unending absorption of presence into memory, until the banquet hall no longer belonged to those who laughed and drank, but to the invisible insistence that pressed them into being and unbeing simultaneously, a quiet, inescapable choreography older than fear itself, older than life, older than wine. By the evening of the 6th of March, 1672, the palace had shifted into something unrecognizable, a vessel of gilded walls and chandeliers that pulsed with a quiet, patient hunger, as if it had waited centuries for this night to come. The first disappearances were noticed subtly at first, a misstep here, a faint distortion in the periphery of vision there, until it became undeniable. Guests raised their hands to speak, their voices dissolving into the gilded air, swallowed by the heavy, velvet tapestries that hung like patient jaws, thick with the smell of wax, iron, and rotting memory. The chefs, sweating beneath their white caps, noticed the motions first, a hand that trembled on the edge of a platter, a shoulder vanishing at the turn of the head, a shadow that lingered too long and bent at angles impossible for flesh. Patrons flickered at the edges, translucent, limbs blurred into air and light, moving through walls and furniture as if the palace were a living mouth, swallowing form and substance alike, digesting the heat of life into the rhythm of the marble floors. Laughter twisted into hollow echoes, reverberating endlessly, pressing against the veins of the floor, vibrating through bones, compressing ribs and sinew into the rhythm of absence, a slow, insistent compression that made every breath feel borrowed. The mirrors multiplied these disappearances, reflecting not the living but fragments of vanished forms, stretching and bending their shapes into grotesque parodies, a mosaic of flesh and gold that pressed upon the eyes until the mind strained to hold the image without fracturing. Every step across the polished floors drew another whisper, another pulse, another fold of presence into absence, the weight of centuries pressing invisibly from the gilded ceilings, the twisted carvings, the candelabras that leaned subtly inward, breathing with a patience older than the guests could comprehend. A hand once visible on a silver tray vanished into translucence, leaving behind the warmth of a pulse that was not quite heat, a subtle impression that pressed the air itself into the shape of flesh and bone, curling around the edges of perception. The air was thick with the scent of melting wax, spilled wine, roasted meats, and the faint, iron tang of something older, a decay pressed into memory, carried in the invisible breath of the palace, settling into the lungs, embedding itself into hair and skin. Tapestry swayed as though moved by invisible currents, folding corners of the hall into their own weight, brushing against ankles, wrapping around calves, climbing the legs of chairs, lifting in time with the pulse that threaded through the floors, walls, and ceilings alike. Guests who attempted to look directly at the shadows found themselves staring into something older than reflection, a form of memory pressed into gold and glass, a repetition of gestures and postures performed by those who had once walked these halls, long dead, folded into the pattern of the banquet. The chandeliers above trembled in delicate rhythm, the crystals chiming faintly against one another, a brittle, metallic song threading through the hall like the echo of bones, vibrating through floors and ceilings, pressing into sinew and tendon, dictating the subtle movements of guests who no longer commanded their own limbs. Each breath drew fragments of history into the chest, embedding the pulse of those long gone into muscle and marrow, a slow absorption that left lips tinged with iron, eyes clouded with the weight of watching what could not be unseen, and hands trembling from the resistance of air that had become viscous, heavy with presence. Tables seemed to stretch and bend under invisible pressure, chairs tilted and spun slightly, the marble floors contracting subtly beneath boots, pressing upward into knees and spine, guiding the living into movements that echoed those of shadows flickering at the periphery. The mirrors multiplied this effect, layering ghostly forms over living flesh, the edges of reality fraying as limbs elongated or vanished entirely, torsos flattened and reformed, faces stretched into silent expressions of horror and recognition. Chefs, observing from the kitchens, noted the faint coppery smell of blood that lingered despite no wounds visible, the heat of flesh pressing into the air, the metallic tang seeping through cracks in doors and walls, drawing the living into a rhythm older than thought, older than reason. Candles flickered as if caught in windless drafts, shadows bending and stretching to match forms that no longer obeyed gravity, coiling along gilded moldings, dipping into the curves of carved furniture, rising to touch the chandeliers, brushing against the ceiling in slow arcs that made the eyes ache. Every movement of the guests was mirrored by some imperceptible presence, a subtle tug at muscle and sinew, a pressure in the chest and shoulders, as if the palace itself were folding them into a choreography designed before their birth. The laughter continued, hollow now, layered, echoing endlessly, resonating through veins of marble and stone, pressing down, compressing ribs, threading through sinew, bending fingers into gestures they did not intend, bending torsos into rhythms older than any heartbeat in the hall. Faces in the mirrors blinked in impossible timing, mouths moving without sound, gestures precise and deliberate, reflecting a memory that was not their own, yet somehow drawn from the bodies of those present, a dance between the living and the vanished that twisted the perception of the hall into something impossible to disentangle. The more the guests tried to focus, the more the palace consumed their attention, bending the gilded ceilings into angles they could not name, folding the tapestries into impossible curves, elongating doorways, twisting floors and walls subtly to press the living into alignment with the rhythm of absence that had begun to thrum through the palace like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. The chandeliers chimed again, delicate and brittle, threading a song that pressed awareness into muscles and marrow alike, guiding the hands to lift goblets, the shoulders to bend, the feet to step in accordance with some quiet, patient insistence older than memory. Wine slipped into lungs and blood alike, deep red and viscous, coating the tongue with iron and forgetfulness, pulling fragments of identity loose and folding them into the invisible choreography of shadows and mirrors. Every reflection multiplied the effect, layering fragments of flesh over gold, over mirrors, over the cold, polished floors, until it became impossible to discern the living from the absent, the present from memory, the voice from silence. The air thickened further, pressing into hair and skin, embedding the scent of roasted meats, melting wax, and iron into every breath, until every inhalation carried the weight of centuries. Every exhale returned a pulse older than fear itself, guiding limbs, folding bodies, pressing the living into a hall that no longer belonged to them, but to the persistent rhythm of absence, to the slow, patient hunger of a palace that had learned to consume form, flesh, and memory alike. The crown itself began to pulse with a rhythm that was felt deep in the bones, a slow, insistent beat that seemed aware of every shifting body beneath its gaze, as though the gold had learned to record absence and press it into the marrow of those who dared enter the hall. On the night of the 7th of March, 1672, each banquet course arrived with a weight more felt than seen, plates sliding across the tables as if guided by invisible hands, morsels tasting faintly of ash and memory, the roasted pheasant and glazed venison carrying the tang of smoke from fires long extinguished, mingling with the metallic trace of blood pressed into the walls and floorboards by centuries of feasts and vanishings. Guests who had walked, laughed, and feasted moments before now pressed against invisible walls, flattened shadows sprawling across the tapestries like ink bleeding into silk, their features dissolving into intricate, almost ritualistic patterns of gold and crimson that mapped themselves along the ceiling, twisting the chandeliers into impossibly delicate shapes that hummed in the resonance of loss. The kitchen was thick with the scent of charred meat, wine, and something older, fouler, a tang of decay that belonged neither to the living nor to the dead, but to the memory of centuries of forgotten banquets, pressed into the air, the copper pots, the waxed floors, saturating every breath taken by those who moved through the corridors. The silver trays, once polished to perfection, seemed to wobble subtly, tilting slightly as if the weight of those who had vanished lingered upon them, an invisible presence pressing the metal down into shapes that reflected nothing of the present, only echoes of hands that had once reached and mouths that had laughed in tones now forever silenced. Each movement of a guest sent ripples across the hall, faint vibrations in the polished marble that threaded upward into legs, knees, and spine, a subtle insistence that bent posture, compelled gestures, and drew limbs into the choreography of absence. The mirrors, hung in perfect symmetry along the walls, began to warp subtly, edges curling inward and twisting reflections into forms that were simultaneously familiar and grotesque, layering translucent shapes over the living until it was impossible to discern which figure belonged to flesh and which belonged to the shadows pressed into gold leaf and glass. Wine flowed slowly, thick and deliberate, pooling in goblets and coating lips with iron and forgetfulness, dragging fragments of memory from the drinkers' minds and embedding them into the pulse of the palace, a rhythm older than breath, older than laughter, older than grief, threading through tendon and sinew, pressing the living into the hall as though they were never meant to leave. The air vibrated with a subtle metallic hum, faint but insistent, threading between chandeliers and candelabras, curling into the folds of the tapestries, brushing against ankles and calves with the soft insistence of a hand guiding each movement, bending muscles, twisting joints, enforcing a cadence that was both invisible and undeniable. Shadows crawled along gilded moldings, dipping into the curves of chairs and tables, reaching upward to the ceilings in arcs that defied gravity, touching chandeliers with fingertips that left faint traces of cold where heat had once lingered, weaving forms that mirrored the living and yet belonged only to absence. Guests found themselves moving in time with the pulse of the crown, their bodies bending in ways they could not control, hands lifting goblets, shoulders tilting, knees flexing, all in a choreography older than the hall itself, orchestrated by the subtle insistence of gold, wax, wine, and absence. The chandeliers chimed, faint and brittle, their metallic voices threading through the hall in patterns that pressed into the chest and shoulders, into sinew and bone, guiding the living into movements that mirrored those who had vanished long ago, whose gestures were etched into the pulse of the palace, repeating in delicate loops that bent time and memory. Plates of food slid closer to guests as if anticipating hands that were no longer entirely their own, morsels leaving faint trails in the air, the aroma of roasted meats mingling with smoke, iron, and the sweetness of something ancient and forbidden, pressing into the nostrils and lungs, embedding itself into every breath, until the air itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of those long vanished. The mirrors multiplied every subtle shift, layering reflections of absence over the living, limbs stretching, torsos flattening, faces elongating and twisting into silent screams and expressions of horror and recognition that pressed into the consciousness, embedding themselves into memory before the mind could resist. Guests who paused found their reflections performing gestures they had not intended, movements precise, deliberate, and insistent, bending fingers, elbows, knees, and shoulders into a choreography older than thought, older than intention, a rhythm dictated by the crown and carried in the subtle vibration of the hall. The ceilings seemed to breathe, gilded moldings curling as if inhaling and exhaling in time with the pulse of absence, the chandeliers dipping and rising in delicate arcs, shadows pressing outward along the tapestries, folding over the guests, embedding them into forms that were both present and vanished, a slow absorption of flesh and memory into the hall itself. The wine, the food, the smell of charred meats and wax, the metallic tang in the air, each element wove together into a single, unyielding rhythm, pressing awareness and muscle into alignment with the palace, bending the living into repetition until their own presence was inseparable from the pattern of absence, from the slow, deliberate choreography of gold and shadow that had learned to claim flesh, memory, and breath. Guests became part of the ceiling and walls, their forms pressed into intricate mosaics of crimson and gold, a tapestry of absence layered over presence, hands reaching through air that no longer yielded, mouths opening in silent song, limbs elongating, torsos twisting into shapes dictated by a pulse older than time itself. The crown pulsed with increasing insistence, a subtle heartbeat threading through mirrors, shadows, floors, and ceilings, drawing the living into the rhythm, embedding them further into absence, until the banquet hall was no longer a place of feasting but a repository of memory, of flesh, of shadow, a vessel of gold, wine, and ash that pressed all who entered into a slow, inevitable choreography older than life, older than fear, older than reason, leaving no guest untouched, no form unclaimed, no memory free from the insistence of the crown that pulsed with the rhythm of what had been and would never cease. By the 10th night of March, 1672, the palace had transformed into a labyrinth of reflections and echoes, a place where gold and shadow folded into one another until it became impossible to distinguish floor from ceiling, wall from air, presence from absence. The living stumbled over what had once been human feet, now translucent, cold, sliding beneath their boots like water pressed into the grain of marble, leaving no mark but the faint impression of absence that clung to the soles and lifted with each step. The grand halls, which had once resounded with music, laughter, and the chatter of courtly intrigue, now hummed with the synchronized pulse of forgotten names, a rhythm older than memory threading through every joint and tendon, vibrating through floorboards that carried the weight of centuries of vanished footsteps, compressing the chest and spine of anyone who dared move too quickly. Chandeliers swayed imperceptibly, casting fractured prisms of light that stretched along gilded moldings, elongating shadows that twisted and reformed, brushing against shoulders, brushing across ankles, bending the limbs of the living into movements they neither chose nor could resist. Mirrors multiplied every detail, reflecting not the flesh that remained, but layers of absence stacked upon absence, translucent forms moving in perfect, insistent loops that pressed into the eyes, into the mind, imprinting a choreography older than life, older than the music that once filled the halls, older than breath itself. Guests wandered through corridors that lengthened and narrowed without warning, ceilings dipping subtly, as if inhaling, walls pressing inward like the ribs of some slow, deliberate beast, their steps guided by a rhythm dictated by the pulse of the crown, the weight of wine, the insistence of gold and absence. Plates of untouched food waited on tables, each morsel releasing faint traces of charred meat, the smell of smoke, and something older, fouler, the tang of iron and rot pressing into the air, embedding itself into lungs and hair, until every breath drew history directly into the body. The floorboards creaked beneath feet, but the sound was not random. It was a measured cadence, a resonance threaded through centuries, echoing the steps of those who had been consumed, pressing the living into alignment with the invisible choreography that unfolded with slow, inevitable patience. Hands lifted goblets in rhythm without thought, shoulders tilted, knees bent, torsos twisted as if pulled by invisible strings, movements mirrored precisely by figures that were no longer human, translucent forms curling across walls, through windows, under tables, pressing their absent weight into the bones of the living. The chefs, pale and trembling, observed from the kitchens, noting the subtle shifts in air temperature as each guest moved, the metallic tang in the corners of their nostrils, the faint echo of voices that had long since been silenced, pressed into the walls and floorboards and replaying in delicate, insistent loops. Candles flickered in time with the pulse of absence, wax dripping slowly, molten threads stretching across floors, catching in cracks and grooves, carrying the smell of iron, smoke, and faintly sweet decay, embedding themselves into the memory of those who watched too closely, whose eyes lingered too long on the shifting forms of shadows that had once been flesh. The crown, resting atop the dais, pulsed with increasing insistence, threading a heartbeat through the hall that drew eyes, limbs, attention, and breath into its rhythm, folding the living into a continuity that was older than any guest could comprehend. Every glance into a mirror pressed a fragment of the self into the tapestry of absence, elongating torsos, stretching fingers, bending spines, a slow absorption of identity into the unyielding pattern of the palace. The wine flowed with deliberate viscosity, coating tongues, filling lungs, dragging names, faces, and memories loose from minds and embedding them into the pulse of the palace, a rhythm older than grief, older than fear, threading through marrow, sinew, and tendon, bending the living into alignment with the absent, the vanished, the never to return. Shadows pressed along moldings, coiling through arches, climbing chandeliers, brushing against walls in deliberate arcs, curling around legs, feet, and shoulders, their cold weight pressing limbs into gestures that belonged to neither the living nor the dead, but to the slow choreography dictated by gold, mirrors, wax, and absence. The floorboards quivered in resonance with invisible steps, vibrations threading upward through knees, thighs, and spine, embedding the rhythm of centuries into flesh, bending the posture of anyone who dared remain upright for more than a heartbeat. Faces in mirrors blinked, mouths opened and closed in silent, insistent rhythms, layering over living flesh, over absent forms, over torsos twisted in ways impossible to endure, stretching and folding, pressing consciousness into the pulse of the palace until every perception, every muscle, every breath was folded into a single, continuous rhythm older than the living, older than the vanished, older than time itself. Guests moved through corridors that no longer obeyed geometry, doors elongating, halls narrowing, ceilings dipping subtly to press closer, walls curling inward to brush against ribs, the entire structure breathing with patience and intent, guiding every step, every tilt of a shoulder, every bend of a knee. The laughter that had once echoed in the halls was gone, replaced by a hollow resonance, a chorus of absence threading through walls, floor, and ceiling, pressing into ears, embedding itself into bones, dictating movement, enforcing alignment with the slow, deliberate pattern that the palace had cultivated over centuries. Every shadow stretched toward mirrors, coiling into arches, brushing along surfaces with subtle insistence, embedding limbs into the rhythm of the absent, folding torsos, twisting spines, bending fingers, embedding consciousness into a pulse older than thought, older than intention, older than fear. By midnight, the palace had become a single organism, living and absent at once, breathing, pulsing, pressing all who entered into its choreography, embedding every body, every fragment of flesh, every breath into the rhythm of absence, a slow, relentless absorption of identity, presence, and memory, leaving no guest untouched, no hand free, no mind untangled from the insistent insistence of the crown, the wine, and the gold that had learned to consume what was living. On the 15th of March, 1672, the king himself raised the goblet, its glass catching candlelight in impossible fractures, deep red and viscous, the wine quivering as though it held centuries of memory. The moment it touched his lips, a subtle shiver ran through the hall, threading into the marble floors, up through gilded moldings, and into the veins of chandeliers, vibrating with a rhythm older than breath, older than the pulse of any human heart. The crown upon his head began to tilt, its gold curving and bending, edges elongating into shapes that defied comprehension, reflecting impossible geometries in the mirrors that lined the walls, distorting the entire palace into a labyrinth of light and shadow that pressed into the mind before the eyes could register what was happening. The king's body, resplendent in silk and lace, shimmered at the edges, translucent at first, then increasingly insubstantial, as if each fiber of flesh was being unwoven, pulled into a rhythm dictated by the pulse of gold, wine, and absence. The chandeliers trembled violently, casting fractured prisms that danced over tapestries, ceiling moldings, and marble floors, stretching shadows into forms that were both familiar and grotesque, brushing against the walls and pressing into the air with the soft insistence of a hand that guided motion without touch. The wine's taste lingered, metallic and sweet, pressing its memory into the palate, dragging the pulse of forgotten names from the lips of the king into the air, threading them invisibly into the rhythm of the palace until the walls themselves seemed to breathe with recognition, inhaling presence and exhaling absence. First his hands vanished, fingers curling in perfect imitation of gestures already performed countless times by those who had disappeared before, the sensation of silk sleeves brushing nothing but air, the pulse of gold pressing through bones and muscle into the rhythm of vanishing. His shoulders followed, spine bending in slow, deliberate arcs, a choreography older than the hall, older than the palace itself, and the floorboards beneath quivered in resonance, pressing into the souls of those who had dared linger, imprinting the rhythm into muscle and marrow. The mirrors multiplied the effect, reflecting the king over and over, each iteration more insubstantial than the last, until there was no flesh, no silk, no reflection, only the layering of absence stacked atop absence, every shard of glass a witness to the slow erasure of what had been. The tapestries, once heavy with scenes of hunting and courtly grandeur, seemed to absorb his form, curling edges like slow fingers pulling him into threads of gold and crimson, pressing body, memory, and breath into a pattern older than thought. His voice, when he opened his mouth, emerged as a faint vibration, a resonance threading through the chandeliers, floors, and walls, repeating in delicate, insistent loops that pressed into the consciousness of anyone near enough to perceive, bending perception, bending awareness, bending the living into the rhythm of the vanished. The crown hovered above the dais, floating weightily as if filled not with gold alone, but with centuries of memory, pulsing subtly, a heartbeat threading through air, through stone, through absence, pressing the unseen into every corner, folding empty corridors into themselves until the palace was a single organism, alive with the insistence of what had been and would never cease. Every object, every shard of glass, every trace of wine, every shadow pressed into alignment, threading the living, the vanished, the absent into one slow, deliberate rhythm, a choreography of disappearance that demanded participation, that consumed identity, that left no hand free, no muscle untwisted, no thought unclaimed. By dawn, the palace was emptied of flesh, corridors and halls alive only with smoke like shadows that moved with intent, sliding over marble, curling over tapestries, brushing against mirrors, carrying faint echoes of laughter that had once been vibrant, the lingering scent of roasted meats and wine pressing into the air, embedding itself into the memory of all who dared imagine it. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows, indifferent to the horror pressed into walls and floors, touching gold leaf and marble, reflecting into the empty corridors with a brightness that could not undo the weight of what had vanished. Outside, the world remained unchanged, streets cobbled with horses' hooves, carriages moving along rivers, birds tracing arcs in the sky, yet every heartbeat carried the residue of the banquet, a pulse threaded into the marrow of memory, a rhythm that whispered the horror of disappearance into the living. Anyone who walked near the palace felt it, the faint insistence of absence pressing through bones, lungs tasting iron and wine, muscles folding in subtle, unconscious echo of gestures performed within, a slow imprint of the vanished threading into sinew and thought. The crown remained, heavy with gold and the collected memory of those consumed, floating over the empty dais, pulsing with subtle insistence, a silent herald of the feast that had devoured all who partook. The halls were silent but for the pressure of absence, moving like a tide against ribs and spine, brushing through air, curling around walls, imprinting itself into the living who dared imagine the shimmer of impossible geometry, the metallic tang of memory, the slow, deliberate erasure of flesh. No one spoke, yet the palace breathed with the rhythm of the vanished, a slow, unyielding insistence that presence was temporary, that disappearance was eternal, that the banquet, once begun, would leave an imprint on the world that no sunlight could erase. Shadows slid like smoke along walls and floors, lingering in corners and archways, the faint echo of the king's pulse threading through the air, mingling with the lingering scent of charred meat, wine, and iron pressed into stone, a presence both absent and indelible. By midday, the palace was a vessel of memory alone, corridors curling inward, rooms pressing upon themselves, mirrors layered with reflections of those who had vanished, gold and crimson forming intricate patterns older than time, pressing against perception with a slow, inexorable insistence. The banquet had ended, yet it consumed still, threading its rhythm into the living, leaving a taste of disappearance in every breath, a terror that could not be forgotten, a feast that had claimed its guests and imprinted its horror upon the world outside, so that every step, every heartbeat, every inhalation carried the memory of what had been, a pulse older than life, older than reason, older than mercy, leaving behind only the crown, heavy, pulsing, eternal, and unclaimed.